Competent to Counsel by J. Adams. Chapter 3. What is wrong with the mentally ill? Time magazine most vividly told the story of the revolt of Leo Held. There was among nothing in Leo Held's life that could have presaged the end of it. Held, 40, a blurry, 6-foot, 200-pound, balding lab technician at Lockwell, Pennsylvania, paper mill, had been a school board member, Boy Scout leader, secretary of the fire brigade, churchgoer, and affectionate father. Certainly he bickered occasionally with his neighbors, drove too aggressively over the hilly highways between his Loganton home and the mill, and sometimes fretted about the job that he had held for 19 years. But to most of his neighbors and coworkers, he was a paragon of responsible, respectable citizen. That image was shattered in a well-planned hour of bloodshed last week when Held decided to mount a one-man revolt against the world he feared and resented. After seeing his wife off to work and their children to school, Held, a proficient marksman, pocketed 2 pistols, a .45 automatic and a Smith & Wesson .38, and drove his station wagon to the mill. Parking carefully, he gripped a gun in each fist and stalked into the plant. And he started shooting with a calculated frenzy that filled his fellow worker victims with 2 and 3 bullets apiece, at least 30 shots in all. A hastily formed posse found him in his doorway, armed and snarling defiance. "Come and get me. I'm not taking any more of their bull." Puzzled officials discovered a tenuous chain of logic behind his actions. Mrs. Ram, the quiet, had quit a carpool, complaining of Held's driving. Many victims at the paper plant were in authority over him, or had been promoted while he had not. Held had feuded over smoke from burning leaves. Held's stolid surface had masked translucent resentment and rage. Another neighbor told of a spat over the fallen tree limb that so enraged Held that he beat the 71-year-old widow with a branch. She took him to court on assault and battery charges, but the magistrate threw out her case and Held's cross complaint. If the jurist had thought a little more carefully, and said Mrs. Kinsley, and had seen that here was a man who was sick, and had sent him to a psychiatrist, this thing could have been prevented. The question is, was Held really sick? Was Mrs. Kingsley right? Wittingly or unwittingly, time answers that question. The caption under the picture of the prostrate, wounded killer runs, "Responsible, respectful, and resentful." Time put its finger directly on the real issue. Held was not sick. He was resentful. Yet it is a significant sign of nearly total acceptance of mental illness propaganda that Mrs. Kingsley first thought that he was sick and needs a psychiatrist. Held's true condition was recognized long ago in Proverbs 26:23-26, which describes people who harbor grudges, resentments, and bitterness in their hearts. For a long while, Held was able to cover the resentment with an outer gloss of tranquility and graciousness, but finally the resentment burst through. Consider these words: "Like the glaze covering an earthen vessel are smooth lips with an evil heart." Outwardly, Held seemed respectable. Outwardly, he appeared responsible. But inwardly, his heart seethed with hatred. Held spoke to his scout troop with smooth lips. At church and as members of the fire brigade, he paraded in a glaze of respectability. But Proverbs says, he who hates dissembles with his lips and harbors deceit in his heart. When he speaks graciously, believe him not, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. Proverbs says that anger, hatred, resentment, and bitterness bottled up within given rise to a half a dozen other problems. There are 7 abominations in his heart. What resentment at last grew to the boiling point, Held decided that he would kill everyone who, in his judgment, had wronged him. The passage in Proverbs concludes with the warning that although for a time hatred can be covered over, at length it will be exposed in the assembly. That is, all the feelings and the attitudes down underneath will be revealed, in exactly the way Held eventually spouted forth his hatred in one dramatic public revelation of what he was really like. Not everyone, of course, reveals his inner resentments in precisely the same way. Mental illness, a misnomer. The case of Leo Held illustrates why growing numbers of authorities have begun to object to the concept of mental illness, and the vigorous propaganda campaign which has been conducted under the misleading misnomer. The fact is that the words mental illness are used quite ambiguously. Bachoven speaks, for instance, of indefinability of mental illness, organic malfunctions affecting the brain that are caused by brain damage, tumors, gene inheritance, glandular or chemical disorders. Validity may be termed mental illness. But at the same time, a vast number of other human problems have been classified as mental illness, for which there is no evidence that they have been engendered by disease or illness at all. As the description of many of these problems, the term mental illness is nothing more than a figure of speech, and in most cases, a poor one at that. To put the issue simply, the scriptures plainly speak of both organically based problems as well as problems that stem from sinful attitudes and behavior. But where, in all of God's word, is there so much as a trace of any third source of problems which might approximate the modern concept of mental illness? Clearly, the burden of proof lies with those who loudly affirm the existence of mental illness or disease, but fail to demonstrate biblically that it exists. Until such a demonstration is forthcoming, the only safe course to follow is to declare with all of Scripture that the genesis of such human problem is twofold, not threefold. A certain amount of confusion has been occasioned by the fact that physical illness may have non-organic causes. For example, worry may cause ulcers. Fear may lead to paralysis. These resultant disabilities are ordinarily called psychosomatic illnesses. Psychosomatic illnesses are genuine somatic bodily problems which are the direct result of inner psychological difficulty. But illness caused by psychological stress must be distinguished from illness as the cause of psychological stress. People with personal problems often use camouflage. What then is wrong with the mentally ill? Their problem is autogenetic. It is in themselves. The fundamental bent of the fallen human nature is away from God. Man is born in sin, goes astray, from his mother's womb speaking lies, says Psalms 58:3, and will therefore naturally, by nature, attempt various sinful dodges in an attempt to avoid facing up to his sin. He will fall into varying styles of sin according to the short-term successes or failures of the particular sinful responses which he makes to life's problems. Apart from organically generated difficulties, the mentally ill are really people with unsolved personal problems. There is a mounting conviction that much bizarre behavior must be interpreted as camouflage intended to divert attentions from one's otherwise deviant behavior. The explanation of much behavior as cover-up or camouflage runs something like this. Bizarre behavior sometime in the past, perhaps far back in the past, was rewarded positively when it succeeded in deflecting attention from one's deviant behavior. Therefore, on succeeding occasions, the client again attempted to hide behind bizarre actions and discovered that frequently this ruse worked. If this occurred frequently enough, a pattern of such action was established. Bizarre behavior then became the natural, habitual means to which he resorted whenever he sinned. However, such behavior, though often successful at the outset, frequently enough to become a deeply etched pattern and thus the first resort when one does wrong, does not continue to work as successfully as it did in the past. As one grows out of childhood and into adolescence, for instance, he finds it more difficult to hide. Now he is expected to give rational explanations for his behavior. Rather than change, the habit-dominated person will endeavor to continue to resort to bizarre behavior as his solution. But repeated failures of recent attempts at length force him to make some change. Yet, even then, he changes not the nature of his response, but its intensity. So, in order to continue to cover up his behavior, his actions become more and more bizarre. If the pattern is not broken, his behavior eventually will become so deviant that in the end, society will institutionalize him. In this way, behavior can become totally unacceptable in a very short time. In the long run, the counselee finds that such behavior, even when it hides him from detection, is not really successful. Increasingly, as his actions become more bizarre, he finds that his behavior tends to isolate him. His social contacts are broken off, and the society which he needs so desperately drifts away from him as he hides from it. He knows he is living a lie, and his conscience triggers painful psychosomatic responses. So, at last, he becomes a very miserable person, externally isolated and alienated from others, and internally torn apart. Steve was a young man of college age whom the writer met in a mental institution in Illinois. Steve had been diagnosed by psychiatrists as a catatonic schizophrenic. He did not talk, except minimally, and he shuffled about as though he were in a stupor. Upon sitting down, he became frozen in one or two positions. At first, communication with Steve seemed impossible. He simply refused to respond to questions or to any kind of verbal overtures. However, the counselors told Steve that they knew he understood fully what was going on, that though he might have fooled others, the psychiatrist, his parents, the school authorities, he was not going to fool them. They assured Steve that the sooner he began to communicate, the sooner he'd be able to get out of the institution. Steve remained silent, but was allowed to continue as a part of the group observing the counseling of others. The next week, the guns were turned on Steve, and for more than an hour the counselors worked with him. Steve began to break down. His hesitant replies gave evidence that he clearly understood everything. There was no reason to believe that he had withdrawn from reality. As Steve began to respond, the rough outlines of his problem emerged. By the third week, he broke down entirely. Steve had no mental disorders. Steve had no emotional problems. Nothing was wrong in his mind or his emotions. His problem was autogenic. Steve's problem was difficult, but simple. He told us that because he had been spending all his time as prop man for a play rather than working at his college studies, he was about to receive a raft of pink slips at the mid-semester marking period. This meant that Steve was going to fail. Rather than face his parents and his friends as a failure, Steve camouflaged the real problem. He had begun acting bizarrely and discovered that this threw everyone off track. He was thought to be in a mental stupor, out of touch with reality, mentally ill. The truth was that Steve was hiding behind the guise of illness in much the same way that a grammar school child will feign illness when he doesn't want to take a test for which he was not prepared adequately. Steve had done this sort of thing many times before, but never quite so radically. At times he would go off by himself and grow quiet and still and become hard to communicate with. And at other times he would walk down off the road and wouldn't return for hours. Over the years, Steve gradually had developed an avoidance pattern to which he resorted in unpleasant and stressful situations. When the college crisis arose, he habitually resorted to this pattern. Steve's problem was not mental illness, but guilt, shame, and fear. As he spoke with the counselors, Steve recognized that they were asking him now to make the basic decision he had previously sought to avoid. Steve knew that now he must decide whether he was going to tell the truth to his parents and his friends and leave the mental institution, or whether he was going to continue the bluff. When we left on the 5th week, Steve was still working on that decision. He was actually posing the question himself in these words: would it be better to continue the rest of my life this way, or to go home and face the music? In the process of working with Steve, it became clear that the more others treated Steve as if he were ill, the more guilty he felt. This was so because Steve knew that he was lying. It is important for counselors to remember that whenever clients camouflage, whenever they hide to avoid detection, whenever they purport to be ill when they are not, sick treatment only makes them worse. To act as if they may be excused for their condition is the most unkind thing one can do. Such an approach only compounds the problem. When Steve was approached by those who held him responsible, he responded. For the first time since his commitment, he gained some self-respect. Under those circumstances, he began to talk about his condition. Contrary to much contemporary thought, it is not merciful to be non-judgmental, to consider such counseling victims rather than violators of their conscience, to consider their behavior as neutral or as not blameworthy only enlarges their lie and increases the load of guilt. Such treatment, Steve explained, had been for him sheer cruelty because of the compounded mental anguish and distress it engendered. Nothing hurt more, he said, than when his parents visited him and treated him kindly, like an innocent victim of circumstances. Mary, during her first interview, tried to camouflage herself in order to avoid detection, just as Steve had done. But the techniques that Mary had developed over the years were quite different. Mary had been diagnosed with by psychiatrists as manic depressive. Instead of shutting up, withdrawing, rearing a wall, and challenging the world to batter it down as Steve did, Mary's ploy was, I'll drown you out so you'll stop bothering me. As soon as the counselors began to put their finger on the real issue in Mary's life, which turned out to be adultery with her next-door neighbor, Mary began to howl and scream and cry at the top of her lungs. Besides inarticulate sobbing, she cried, "Leave me alone! Leave me alone!" In the past, Mary had successfully warded off all attempts by her parents and others to discover the reasons for her distress by driving them away. Mary was now using her tried-and-true ruse with the counselors, but they were not abashed at such responses. Instead, they looked Mary squarely in the eye and said, "Oh, be quiet. Unless you stop this kind of nonsense and get down to business, we simply can't help you, Mary. Surely a young girl like you doesn't want to spend the rest of her life in this institution. We know that you have real problems, and we know that there is something wrong in your life. Let's start talking turkey." Instead of showing her sympathy, instead of responding to her tears, instead of being taken in by Mary's tactics, the counselors brushed aside the camouflage and pursued a straight course directly to the heart of the matter. At this, Mary turned off her antics almost as automatically as if she had pushed a button. She told the story, a miserable story, which had been so hard to tell she had never told it to another person before. Mary was helped only because her counselors were not shaken by Mary's screams and tears. They dealt appropriately with her feelings and demanded more content. They insisted on working with data. They called a spade a spade. Mary needed to learn that her habitual response pattern was faulty, and that it would have to abandon it if she really wanted help. Agreeing, Mary found help in confession and change. Often persons come from counseling prepared to perform their little acts, to go through their patterns. Women come with their purses stuffed full of Kleenexes. Men come with their tempers on edge, ready to flare out. But the Christian counselor considers such acting out behavior an opportunity to help. He calls attention to the present behavior and confronts the counselee not only about other problems, but also about the very way in which he is handling the counseling situation itself. When confronting someone concerning such avoidance patterns, counselors must seek to correct such behavior for benefit. They must point out the principles involved, give instruction in biblical responses, and help him to understand how these very patterns of avoidance played a part in getting him in trouble. The counselor then does not simply seek information. It is true that he demands information, but he evaluates not only information, his evaluation also takes account of emotions and actions. All behavior is of concern to the counselor. When feelings are used as a cover-up, the counselor tries to rectify this behavior as well as the problem behavior beneath the camouflage. The whole man and every dimension of his problem must be helped. Homosexuality fits the pattern. Homosexuality provides an additional example that fits this picture. Many cases of homosexuality show a similar pattern of development. The picture is somewhat as follows. Early in life, usually during the pre-adolescent period, Frank became involved in homosexual activities. Before reaching his teens, he began to engage in homosexuality with some regularity. Homosexual sin may first have begun out of curiosity in order to act smart. Frank's sin had a typical beginning when a group of young boys gathered together in a hideout on a vacant lot to form a club. All was innocent enough until someone got the idea that admission to membership in the club should be restricted to those who were willing to take off their clothes. However details of any particular story may go, homosexual sin does not appear to have been the result of genetic factors, but is, as in Frank's case, a learned activity. Before long, a fixed pattern develops, and once having become a habit, homosexuality becomes a way of life. The habit may become so firmly established that homosexuality at first appears to be a genetic problem. But there is no reason for viewing homosexuality as a genetic condition in the light of the scriptures, which declare that homosexual act is a sin. Apart from the work of Christ in their lives, all sinful men will distort God's marvelous gift of sex in one way or another. The particular style of sin, whether homosexual or heterosexual in its orientation, however, is a learned behavior. Homosexuality is the way in which some clients have attempted to solve the sexual difficulties of adolescence and later years. Usually one who commits homosexual sin develops a grossly distorted view of sex and other interpersonal relations. He finds, for instance, that he must lead a double life, so he carries a heavy load of fear and guilt. Part of the homosexual pattern is lying. Anyone leading a double life usually becomes an astute liar. It is very difficult to believe what he says, because he will make promises that he fails to keep. This is particularly frustrating to counselors who also must confront him about his patterns of falsehood. The characteristics of homosexuals accord fully with what we know of other learned behavior. When patterns of anger and resentment are later discussed, these similarities will be noted further. Adrenochrome or schizophrenia. The view espoused in this book is that psychiatry has no exclusive province that it may call its own. Phillips and Weiner are correct when they conclude the psychotherapist is only one of many behavior changers, and psychotherapy is only one of many methods for behavior change. Freud himself was unwilling to say that psychoanalysis had to be performed by a physician. If Christians who do counseling as a full-time calling prefer to use the word psychiatrist to describe themselves, that is a matter of no great moment, though perhaps unwise, so long as they do not claim a territory exclusive of the pastor or physician. The pastor or other Christian counselor works back to back with the physician. The latter will help him immensely in sorting out cases in which thyroid deficiency, myxedemia, and some other similar condition is at the root of the disorder. There is, of course, a gray area between where it is uncertain to both whether a problem stems basically from organic or non-organic sources. The following material illustrates this problem. There is a possibility that some of the bizarre behavior which one meets in so-called schizophrenic persons stems from organic roots. For example, Osmond and Hoffner had proposed a theory based on an idea that perception is distorted in some persons by a chemical malfunction. When adrenochrome is formed in the body, it normally breaks down immediately into other chemicals. According to Osmond and Hofer, in some people, adrenochrome retains its integrity too long before breaking down, and this causes perceptual difficulties. In other people, although adrenochrome breaks down at the normal rate, the adrenochrome breaks down into abnormal chemical forms, which can become the cause of perceptual difficulties. For both of these reasons, some persons experience chemical abnormalities which result in perceptual disorders, which in turn lead to behavior which others interpret as bizarre. According to Oswald and Hoffner theory, the root of the problem does not lie in the person's mind or emotions, nor does the problem arise from sinful behavior, but involves faulty perception, a chemically disordered perception. Many of the same effects that are experienced by people with adrenochrome problems are also reported by those that use LSD, mescaline, and other hallucinogenic drugs. Perception may be distorted in varying ways. Colors may become exceedingly bright or dull. Words on a page may begin to bounce. Books lying flat on the table may seem to fly off. Depth perception may be lost. Foods which normally do not may taste exceedingly bitter. Hearing may be so acute at times that the client is able to hear sounds from 2 or 3 rooms away. So when a client speaks of hearing voices, psychiatrists call these hallucinations. Yet they are not hallucinations at all, but actual voices. The only problem is that the client doesn't realize that he is able to hear voices in such a distance. When books seems to fly off the table, it may raise his arms in defense and draw back quickly. But when others see him do this, they call such behavior bizarre. If the Osmond-Hofer theory has any credence at all, and the final evidence is not yet in, a number of those who currently are labeled schizophrenics could no longer be considered mentally ill, as if their judgment were impaired, but would have to be reclassified as perceptually ill. If perception is the problem, there is nothing wrong with the mental responses to what is perceived. If a book seems to be flying towards you, as your senses wrongly tell you it is, the right thing for the mind to do is to send signals to the arms to protect the head. Seemingly bizarre gestures, therefore, make sense when they are rightly interpreted as a protective response. If faulty depth perception wrongly tells you that someone is about to bump into you, then for you to jog to the side suddenly is the correct thing to do. In other words, the counselee's mind is not sick. He is only seeing things wrongly and is therefore reacting in a proper way mentally to what he perceives wrongly. In our opinion, the Osmond-Hoffer view needs further investigation, but is an excellent example of the sort of explanation that may eventually be discovered to be at the root of some problems. The HOD, or Hoffer-Osmond Diagnostic Test, is a card sort test, now in the form of questions, by which Hoffer and Osmond claim to be able to distinguish those schizophrenics whose problem is chemically based from those whose problem is not. If this theory is confirmed, the diagnostic test should be a valuable tool in helping the counselor to determine whether he needs the physician's help and who needs the counselor's help. Hoffer and Osmond have developed a urine analysis test in which they claim that a mauve spot appears in the majority of the cases in which there are adrenochrome failures. Hoffer and Osmond also claim that a niacinamide treatment in massive doses has a very high incidence of success in curing biochemical adrenochrome problems. So, whether the problem is chemical or moral, the answer to the question which leads this chapter, what's wrong with the mentally ill, seems clear. There may be several things wrong with the so-called mentally ill, but the one cause which must be excluded in most cases is mental illness itself.